Hello and welcome to episode 32 and 33, Spies and Strategists, Evolution of Indian Intelligence Agencies. I believe this is not a wonder for everyone that we are currently seeing a lot of fluctuations in the diplomatic circle, where we see the two country names, specifically India and Canada. So on this occasion, we are of course not going to take a deep dive into the topic of India and Canada, but we'll be taking a deep dive into the evolution of Indian intelligence agencies. So today to discuss this topic in much more detail, what are the dynamics, how have things evolved with a country like India, uh, starting from the scratch, how the agencies were formed. To discuss these things in detail, we have today with us the guest speaker, Dr. Dheeraj Paramesha Chaya. Hi, Dheeraj. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Omkar. Happy to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise, thank you very much. I have been really excited since I read your article. That is the new Mossad, specifically the one that you published, I think, a few weeks ago. And I'm really glad you could buy the time for the podcast. So yeah, really looking forward for the questions ahead.
Thank you
So
very much. It's pleasure is all mine.
yes, yes. So yeah, before we take a deep dive into the topic itself, I would like to know as a person, because you really have done some amazing work. You have published one book as well. So before we start with the topic, can you give us a brief introduction about yourself and like about your academic background, then your journey, and in general how you ended up doing what you're doing at the moment?
Um, okay, so to give you a background about my introduction to intelligence studies, I'll have to go back to 2013. That is the time when I was doing my master's, and I had a brief 2-month internship with a former R&AW officer. He was the deputy chief of R&AW. He had retired as the deputy chief of R&AW, and I had the opportunity to work under his guidance for about 2 months. So during that period, what happened was that he introduced me to a lot of training material. And right about that time, I also tried to explore what is happening in the academic side of things. And I realized that in a number of Western universities, there were studies being conducted on intelligence studies, and these studies, the outcome of these studies was significantly different to what was introduced to me by the R&AW officer. And that's when I realized that there is an academic world of intelligence studies which is significantly different to the training material that is used in the intelligence academies. So I realized that there is a difference between training and education. So that's when I realized that I want to be part of this intelligence studies community. I wanted to get into the academic study of intelligence. And my exploration led me to the conclusion that there's nothing of that sort in India. So I had to look elsewhere. And so when I was on that journey, I realized that the United States and the UK are two countries which actually have good programs, academic programs on intelligence studies. However, there was a significant difference. The difference being that the Americans were more concerned about uh, training analysts who could be part of the American intelligence community in one form or the other, whereas the British academic studies on intelligence were more education oriented, in the sense they were looking at it from multiple dimensions. So I felt that this was a place where I could actually be. So then I made an application for a PhD, and I was fortunate to have got the opportunity to conduct my research under the supervision of two absolutely wonderful scholars, uh, Professor Robert Dover and Professor Mark Fithian. So, under the supervision at the University of Leicester, I did my PhD on trying to understand why nations are, surprised, and how intelligence failures actually lead to strategic surprises. And during the course of that research, I realized that there is something known as intelligence culture. That is, different countries do intelligence in a very different way, and that then determines the nation's chances of being surprised or not. And yeah, the outcome of my research was the publication of my book, which is titled Spying for South Bloc: India's Intelligence Culture and Strategic Surprises. And having completed that, I got to work briefly with the Karnataka State Police Forces. I helped author their intelligence training manual, and I also have delivered lectures for them on various aspects of intelligence and counter radicalization, de radicalization, and so on. So, and from there, I reached the University of Hull as a lecturer in policing, intelligence, and security. So that's the long and short of my journey through intelligence studies.
Interesting. And I would say, firstly, wow. I mean, you did an internship under a former raw officer. So I believe that, I mean, even though if it's a brief stint or something, having an experience under such individuals is highly valuable. I'm saying this because I come from a military school where our commandant, his father, I think his position was colonel at that time, Harish Chandra Parab. So he was the first officer of the independent Indian Army once we got the independence.
Hmm.
And his son was our commandant, and of course he was aged at that time during my military school. But yeah, having such an experience, I can actually feel you, the kind of journey you would have had, and kind of the inspiration and the foundation you would have had through that internship that has brought you to this level. Uh, like and I could relate to it, as you mentioned. There are not many things or avenues related to this in India. It's exactly the same for the military satellites as well when it comes to space technology too.
Yes, I mean
Yeah.
and I mean, if sorry if I may, the larger point. I mean, the relevance of having this kind of journey, right, where you start off with interactions
Yes.
with practitioners and then move into the academic space, is that you you understand both worlds better, and then you know how to bridge the gap between these two worlds. That is something that is generally missing in social sciences that I see, be it in India or anywhere, especially in India, where academics and practitioners operate in silos. There is no conversation happening between the two of them, and that is why we see that when academics speak, they're speaking things that have almost zero relevance to practitioners, and practitioners
Yes.
do things where they can't draw any insights from academics. So I think that for me,
Exactly.
I had the advantage of having this early interaction with both sides, and that's why most of what I've done seems to have relevance with both the academia as well as the practitioners community. So yeah, that is the point that I think we need to emphasize here.
Yes, yes, I absolutely agree with you. I believe this tandem and the parallel cooperation between the academicians and the practitioners should be there because I think this is what helps a sustainable knowledge transfer to the future generation as well. Because if
Absolutely.
either of this are not in tandem with each other,
Hmm.
then we might have a superstar in some position today, but once that person gets down, we don't really have knowledge to transfer to the
Right.
other generation.
Yes. Yes.
So I think this is the reason. Like, I mean, we need both the things, and I hope in India, I mean, there are experts like you as well now. So definitely, I hope things develop on that level in India as well in the future. So yeah, going right ahead into the topic, uh, we know the classic terms. I mean, I would say an abbreviation, IB and RAW.
Hmm.
So I would like you to provide, an overview of the historical background and the establishment of Indian Intelligence Agency.
Okay. To be honest, Omkar, this answer to this question itself would probably take an entire hour, so I'll keep it as
Yes,
brief as possible.
definitely,
Uh,
definitely.
yeah. So purely speaking from an organization point of view, right? Our intelligence agencies, they trace the origins to the colonial period, and it began with the colonial effort to fight a certain form of criminality called the Thuggy crime. So that's how the first establishment of an intelligence agency happened during the colonial period. So for a very long time, even after the Indian Intelligence Bureau was formed during the colonial period, its office in Shimla was known as the Thuggy Daftar or the Thuggy office. So the Thuggy crime basically laid the foundations for the establishment of an organization of intelligence in India. And from then on, the colonial intelligence moved to focus on areas such as revolutionary terrorism. This is not my term. I would definitely not consider those individuals as terrorists. But yeah, from the colonial state's point of view, there was the problem of revolutionary terrorism and communism during the early 1920s, and that is when you see the organization getting the name called Intelligence Bureau. So fast forward to 1947, when we get independence, we inherit the Intelligence Bureau. Though much of the organizational strength moves to Pakistan, we do get some bit of the organization, and also the title of the organization, that is the Intelligence Bureau. There used to be a small joint intelligence committee within the Chiefs of Staff's committee, so we inherited that as well. But for all practical purposes, once we gained independence, it was the Indian Intelligence Bureau that was this behemoth organization looking at all aspects of national security. Especially, in the year 1950, the decision was taken to make the IB responsible for both external security and internal security and counterintelligence and all aspects of national security. Then in 1962, we have this war with China, in which India was surprised, and it was a terrible humiliation. And after the war, it was decided that we need to have certain covert action agencies. And so India raised three organizations, namely Special Service Bureau, which today is Sashastra Seema Bal, an organization, a border guarding organization on the India, Nepal, and India Bhutan borders, traces its origins to. So you had the SSB, and you had the Special Frontier Force, which gained its prominence recently during the India China clashes at Galwan, and you had the Aviation Research Center. So you have these three organizations that were created in 1963 under something known as the Directorate General of Security. But in 1968, on 21st September, when India's dedicated foreign intelligence agency, that is the Research and Analysis Wing, was formed, the DGS was subsumed by the RNDW. So these were the organizations that functioned almost till the end of the millennium. But after the Kargil war, there was the Kargil Review Committee, and then there was a group of ministers committee that came together to review India's national security establishment as it was. And they came to the conclusion that there needs to be further review and revamp of India's intelligence establishment. So, as a consequence, what we see is that there was another organization that was created, which is called the National Technical Research Organization, which was supposed to resemble the United States National Security Agency. And there was also a defense intelligence agency created, which brought together the service intelligence of all the three armed services, right? The Army, Navy, and Army, Navy, and the Air Force. So,
Yes.
as of today, I think this is. I mean, there are numerous other agencies. You have the police intelligence agencies, and you have the intelligence wings of the Central Armed Police Forces, and so on. But broadly speaking, when you're talking about strategic intelligence agencies, this is what we have. We have the IB, we have the RNDW, we have the NTRO, and we have the DIA. So these are the four most prominent intelligence organizations that we have. And we also have something known as the National Security Council Secretariat, which does most of what the JIC used to do at one point in time. So it's a bit of a confusing system. I know I've brought up a lot of names and a lot of years, but that's how it is, because historically we've not had this coherent thought process about how we want to think about India's national security, how what institutions we want to raise to address it. So we've only been adding up agencies after one crisis after another, and so that's how we've got to where we are today.
Interesting. Yeah, just as you mentioned about this, and I think the world very well knows about Rameswar Natka, especially after Nitin Gokhale sir, the
Yeah.
founder of Strategists Global. He wrote a book on it, and it's an amazing book actually. I think the still few of the recordings are still yet to be out, so I think he might be updating it after 2027.
Hmm.
But apart from that, I just wanted to know it from a much more strategic perspective because you said it's from before the independence itself, our country or, our experts were actually, in the sphere of intelligence. So, how much influence did Indian National Army and I would say specifically Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, his view, his perspective, and his tactics have possibly influenced the agencies?
The influence of the Indian National Army on India's security agencies has been minimal to nil, actually, because we see that post independence, the Indian Army was quite clear that they did not want any of INA's cadres to be reinstated into the Indian Army, and quite logically so, because once they deserted the Indian Army, and the Indian Army being an institution that prides on discipline and so on, so it was naturally understandable that they did not want to absorb these INA cadres into their fold. But because India's political leadership at that point in time did not have a clear understanding of how to make use of intelligence for national security and so on, they were not absorbed into any intelligence role as well. but only some of them were made ambassadors. The best example being ACN Nambiar, who was posted in Europe at that point in time. So some of them did serve in the diplomatic community, but as far as intelligence community is concerned, there did not seem to be any influence of the INA cadres, either from the point of view of strategies or operations or anything for that matter. It was purely an Indian effort that had to be restarted post independence, with some bit of memory that served from the British colonial period.
Interesting. And just taking I would say like a follow-up question on the same lines. So, how do the roles and missions of agencies like RAW and IB differ from each other within the intelligence community? And specifically, can you also little bit briefly extend on even NI and NTRO as well?
Okay, so when we got independence, we inherited the Indian Intelligence Bureau from the colonial period. But in 1950, what happens is that I mean, until then, our perception was that the Himalayas exist, and then Tibet is sort of a buffer between India and China. But in
Okay.
1950, that ceases to be the reality, right? With the Chinese PLA's actions in Tibet. So it was around that time India organizes, thanks to a letter written by the then Home Minister Sardar Patel. India organizes a committee. It is called the Himmat Singh Ji Committee, or it is also called the North and Northeastern Borders Committee. I think that's the name it had. And according to the committee's findings, the IB was made responsible for all sorts of intelligence: external intelligence, internal intelligence, and even strategic military intelligence.
Okay.
So that was in 1950, and that continued all the way up till 1968. The IB initially was found it very difficult to generate military intelligence and so on, but we can discuss that later. But nevertheless, this arrangement went on till 1968. Once Indira Gandhi came to power in 1966, and she had very different ideas. There are numerous reasons about why she created the R&AW. But once the R&AW was created, it was decided that it will function as the dedicated intelligence agency for uh, generating foreign intelligence in India. So all this while, what had happened was between 1950 and 1968, you had the IB, which had a small group within it, which had a small desk within the IB, which looked at external intelligence. Funnily, it was
Okay.
called NGO, which meant not to go out because nobody was actually posted out. Yeah, no? So that's how
Okay.
bad the situation was. So
Got it.
so that's how it was. But in 1968, when the R&AW was created, and you said that this is going to be a dedicated agency to cover foreign intelligence, then I mean you couldn't have that kind of a funny scenario anymore. This was an agency meant to gather intelligence from across the borders, and you see its missions also spreading across the world as and when it was required. But we can come to its expanse much later. But then what happens is, in at the start of the 1990s, there is a problem again. There is the problem of terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism picking up, especially since the 1993 Bombay blasts and so on. And then finally, when you come to the Kargil War in 1999, again that was another instance when which gave the impetus to the political leadership to think about India's national security establishment as it was. So there they decided that yes, now the R&AW will continue doing its business of foreign intelligence, but the IB also, because of the problem of terrorism, will have a limited mandate in liaising with foreign security agencies that are dealing with counterterrorism, but it will do this in coordination with the R&AW. All right. So
Okay.
now what we see from 2001 is that both IB and R&AW have, I mean, the R&AW definitely has a foreign intelligence dimension, but the IB too is sort of sharing some responsibility along with the R&AW. Coming to the NTRO is supposed, like I said, it was supposed to act something similar to the American National Security Agency. So it is supposed to be India's premier technical intelligence agency. So it got most of its infrastructure from the R&AW, because its asset, once the NTRO was formed, much of the assets from the R&AW were moved to the NTRO. But there is still no clear clarity if NTRO is the only organization functioning as India's technical intelligence agency, or the R&AW and the IB and other organizations are also having a significant role. Because even within the R&AW, there is a technical division, the IB has also improved its technical intelligence capabilities. The Indian Armed Forces have also a significant signals intelligence component. So, despite the fact that NTRO is the nodal agency for all sorts of technical and signals intelligence, the service intelligence and other intelligence agencies are also having a role in it. So, the point that I'm trying to make here is that in India, you don't have these watertight systems. There is a certain degree of overlap between these agencies, and that is naturally so
Yes.
because of the threat environment in which India resides, because there is nothing in India that you can clearly call that this is a domestic threat or this is a foreign threat. There seems to be a significant overlap between much of them, and that is why when you talk to some of the IB officers, right, they don't refer to internal threats as just merely internal threats. The term that they use is externally fostered internal threats, which means that there is a foreign dimension as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this is how we see the division of labor between these agencies.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And just to kind of extend for our audience, so the full form of RAW is Research Analysis Wing, and NTRO is National Technical Research Organization. I'm telling this because we have quite a lot of audience from the space industry,
Mhm.
and they're not so much familiar with the security circle. Of course, through the podcast, I'm making them familiar, but I just wanted to, put this note for our audience. So yeah, proceeding ahead a little bit with the agency conversation. Uh, so can you discuss the major successes and setbacks of raw IB, or even in the recent time NTRO, or like from your experience, like what have you like specifically thought, okay, this might be uh, a prime success of the agency, or this might be possibly a cavity where the agencies can improve from your perspective?
All right, Omkar. So this is a very important question, and I say so because the answer to this question will depend on who you ask this question, right? Because in intelligence,
Yes.
there are the intelligence agencies. So yeah, there are the intelligence
Yeah.
agencies. There are the clients or customers, the consumers who consume the intelligence that is given by the intelligence agencies, and you also have the media and public opinion, right?
Yes.
So whenever there is some sense of disaster that happens, the knee-jerk reaction for the media is to call it an intelligence failure. I mean, they have
Yes.
no stakes, they have no skin in the game, so it's very easy to make
Easy
such
to say. Yeah.
sensational claims and move on. And as far as the intelligence agencies are concerned across the world, they unfortunately the way they operate is that they have to, especially in countries where there is not significant accountability and so on, they have to just swallow the criticisms and not speak back, right? And as far as the consumers are concerned, if at all it's a successful operation, it is a successful operation. But if it fails, then intelligence can easily be made a scapegoat, right? And I tell this because as an academic, right, I want you all to understand that whenever we talk of intelligence failures, right, there is a
Yes.
clear distinction between what is intelligence failure and what is information or knowledge gaps, right?
Yes.
Now, because this basic distinction is not understandable for many of our consumers, that's where these cries of intelligence failure comes. And in this, I hold the Indian armed forces and the Indian security personnel, including the police forces, highly responsible for not managing to understand this distinction, right? So let me give you an example. If you look at the
Yes.
history of the RNW and the IB, right, you
Yeah.
will not see that there are many significant failures as such. The reason is because the two failures that we can talk of, yes, the 1962 war. Why? Because in 1962, the Indian Intelligence Bureau did not understand the strategic environment in which it was operating, in the sense that it did realize that China was an enemy, but it could not make sense. It could not conduct the military analysis of whatever China-related information that it had gathered, and that was because organizationally the IB was extremely weak on military intelligence analysis. So that was one instance where there was an intelligence failure. And the second instance of a failure in foreign policy was the RNDW's inability to understand the LTTE. Right? I
Yes.
recall having a conversation with the RNDW officer who was the handler of Mr. Prabhakaran, and he clearly told me that we just couldn't understand this man. That is in reference to Prabhakaran. So
Yes.
the strategic understanding of the entire Tamil movement that was happening in Sri Lanka was sort of flawed. So these two can be regarded as intelligence failures because you're operating on fundamentally wrong assumptions, fundamentally wrong assessments, which then make
Yes.
your policies completely wrong. But otherwise,
Yes.
what happens is uh, where where the army or where the police forces tend to raise complaints about the central intelligence agencies is in terms of giving tactical intelligence. Now, somewhere Indian intelligence agencies are not geared for provision of such kind of tactical intelligence. For instance, you talk to any police officer and with regard to say the protection of a VIP or something, they will casually say that every time we've received an IB's assessment, it is open to all sorts of possibilities, nothing specific about what how the threat is going to manifest or anything of that sort. Now, that is something that's tactical intelligence, right? That is something that these
Yes.
security forces themselves will have to go hunt for that kind of information. It is not something that the RNDW or the IB can provide. Yes, of course, if they come across that information, they can always pass it on to you, but it is beyond their mandate and beyond the resources that they have to produce that kind of information. So those
Yes.
kind of information gaps will always exist, and they, according to me, cannot be considered as intelligence failures, right? So the
Yes.
IB's other intelligence failures, if we have to talk about, in 1993 when the serial bomb blast happened in Bombay, right?
Yes.
They knew that there was a significant shift happening in Pakistan's strategy towards the Pakistani ISI strategies towards India. But what they could not estimate is to what extent they could collaborate with the Mumbai mafia, with the Bombay mafia. That is something that they missed. Similarly, in 2011-12, when stone pelting started in Kashmir, that was
Yes.
something that they missed. They could not understand the shift that was happening. So those kind of failures are there, but they're few and far between. And that is because historically, I mean, as far as internal security is concerned, one the IB's first and major failure was the Indian freedom struggle itself. The fact that India
Yes.
became independent from Britain, right? That itself was their failure in a sense. So they understood what was happening and they understood how to tackle the threat of subversion and so on. So that is why you see them do really well. And as far as the R&DW is concerned, they they have understood the neighborhood much better than any other institution in India, because they
Yes.
this is one organization that works on true empirics. And I have seen this with numerous examples where you have the MEA or you have the Indian Army operate on certain doctrines, operate on certain assumptions, but this is one agency which tells, look, this is what I see, this is what I know, right? So to even take
Yes.
for example the 1990 and Kargil war, right? The agency was one of the first ones to say that just because you've tested nuclear weapons and both countries have gone nuclear doesn't mean that there's not going to be conflict between the two of them, right? They were very clear to the fact that they were aware of the fact that there is a significant section in Pakistan which wanted to exploit this nuclear parity that has come across, right? So which
Yes.
is where you'll see that sometime in, I think this was in September 1998, where they clearly said that a limited offensive is clearly possible. But when the consumers
All
came
right.
really heavy
Right.
on them, they had to backtrack it and then go back to their to things like economic analysis and so on, to say that Pakistan does not have the capacity to now conduct war and so on. So that is, so I think that there is a larger dialogue missing between the intelligence agencies and the consumers, and as a consequence, the consumers in India are they lack this kind of literacy, intelligence literacy. That's a term that I would like to use. So once they get that, I think there'll be a better coordination, which I think right now it has come up to a certain degree, but still there is a lots there's a lot distance to cover in this on this front.
Interesting. Like, it's really great that you provided an extended outlook on, the neighboring foreign policies as well of India. So, a little bit, to go a step ahead in that, how have changes in global geopolitics specifically influenced the evolution of RAW and IB strategies and its priorities for the foreign policy as well?
Well, it is not exactly global geopolitics alone, because for Indian intelligence agencies, for their priorities, it has always been a combination of the global geopolitics as well as India's responses to it. Because it is not necessary that India's security situation is always influenced by global geopolitics.
Yes.
That is not the case, because if you go back to the Nehruvian period, we saw ourselves as part of this. as somebody who can build peace between competing parties, and that is the kind of thinking that was there during the Nehruvian period. But after that, we
Yes.
realized that somehow we are limited to our geography, that is the South Asian geography, and the South Asian region and the Indian Ocean region will remain India's area of influence. So our
Yes.
entire policies at that point in time, say from the mid 60s, or from the 1970s onwards, was to make sure that there is no extra regional influence within the South Asian region, and to that extent
Yes.
the RNAW and the IB was operating. But today, I think India is not India of the 1970s or 80s. India's power position is completely different. India's aspirations are completely different, and to that extent, the RNAWs and the IB strategies also have to undergo a significant change, because right now we will. I would believe that the agencies are not only looking for strategic threats, but they're also in lookout for strategic opportunities that the country can exploit positively to improve its stature. So to that extent, I do believe that global geopolitics has influenced the agency strategies and priorities. And from today's point of view, um, as far as the IB goes, I'm quite clear that India has a realization that so long as its house is not in order, its ability to project power internationally will be limited. And so there seems to be a clear mandate for the IB that all domestic security threats need to be handled carefully and put an end to. And that is why we see that the problem of jihadist terrorism is almost it's almost come to a nil. We haven't seen many terrorist attacks happen in India other than in the
Yes.
Kashmir theater. And we also see that there is a strong will to also settle most of the northeastern disputes, though Manipur now is on fire, which is something that's pretty sad. But yeah, there were efforts being made by the government at least to settle the Naga issue and so on. So I think that the IB strategies to that extent are clearly sorted out. And as far as the RNAW goes, I think there is far more rigor now, and vigor now, and there is this expectation on the agency to make sure that the world opinion and the public opinion across the world is somehow positively shaped in favor of India, which is something that it has been doing even in the past, since at least the days of the 1971 war and so on. So yes, there is a certain sense of continuity, but it's just that the scale has significantly gone up.
Yes. And a little bit on the same lens, I would say, from the perspective of the agencies, whichever agency, I mean, like you can tell it from your perspective. So, can you shed a little bit light on foreign policy and its how it is used to influence the regime by these agencies for the regime change, possibly, or maybe possibly to create a good diplomatic channels to resolve the conflict without engaging into the armed conflict?
Right. So as far as I mean, when you look at covert action, right, there are two ways of pulling it off. It's either we
Yes.
generally focus on covert regime change, but there is also covert regime protection, right? It goes both ways. Sometimes you might want to change the regime that is in power because you believe that they are not favorable to you, but at the same time, you might want to protect a certain regime, considering the fact that they are the most ideal ones from your foreign policy point of view. So I think India has had a history of both of them, and though not using the intelligence agencies per se, back in 1950s itself, Nehru had used his diplomatic might in Nepal, for instance. Where there was a pro democracy movement coming up, and India had supported it. So I can go back to the 1950s to say that India has always wanted to have some kind of regional influence. But come to the 1970s, 1960s and 70s, especially after the 62 war, this aspiration actually expands. So you see India being involved in almost all of the countries in its neighborhood in order to establish a regime that is favorable to them. So we see that first with, for I can give you the example of the 1971 war itself, right? Since the 1962 India-China war, India had always been in Indian intelligence agencies had been in contact with um, elements in East Pakistan, the Bengal elements in East Pakistan, and This was a carefully crafted strategy because if you recall India before 1971, right, you had the northeastern region being sandwiched between China in the north and Pakistan in the south, which was then called East Pakistan. And you had this narrow corridor, that's the Siliguri corridor, which could be cut off at any point in time, and your northeast states would be, at the mercy of your enemy states. So from that point of view, India was clear that it had to have some bit of influence in East Pakistan. So you had a man named Mr. Sankaran Nair. Today, everybody knows R.N. Kao, as you said, because of the book that's been written by Mr. Nitin Gokhale. But R.N. Kao's deputy, Mr. Sankaran Nair, was also an important personality as far as India's intelligence history goes. So he had developed significant contacts with several influential people within the East Pakistan polity and military and society and so on. So those connections did continue. So it was a very subtle kind of operations to make sure that there is some sort of influence gained. But once the domestic political situation changed in Pakistan, once the elections of 1969 were sort of were declared null and void because the East Pakistanis ended up with the majority. So it was at that point in time, which also led to a refugee crisis and so on. It's a long story. I'm just trying to cut it short here. So it was at that point in time that India realized that we have to do something. And but this case is important. Whatever I tell you from here on, right, that actually tells you the story of how covert operations are actually planned. So from January of 1971 till December of 1971, there was a lot of covert action planning and execution that India had conducted before the war. The war happened in December. From January to March, India was not really clear about whether they wanted an independent Bangladesh, whether they should sponsor the insurgency that was happening in East Pakistan or not. And that is because there were several individuals and institutions in New Delhi who are giving very different points of views. It was only the Indian intelligence agency under the leadership of R.N. Kao which was favoring covert operations. But all other institutions were not in favor of it. So we took a hands-off approach until March. It was from March to August, between March and August, that India decided that look, the world is not going to help us. There is a serious refugee crisis happening, and also considering the national security threat that we are facing, with the possibility of um, a two-front war and so on, it was decided that okay, let's just give some bit of help and assistance to the Bengali fighters. Right. So at that point in time, you see the RNDW get into action on two fronts. One is to use the SSB, the organization that I was talking about, to provide, along with the BSF, to provide covert paramilitary assistance to the Bengali rebels, that is to arm them, to provide them training and so on. But most importantly, now this is something that we need to remember because it also has relevance to some of the accusations that are being made against the agency today as well, is that they conducted operations across the world to shed light on the atrocities that were happening against the Bengalis. So the RNW had something
Okay.
known as the psychological warfare division, and they joined hands with the Bengalis. They joined hands with musicians across the world, with and they spread propaganda. Propaganda, though the word carries a negative connotation today, but it was white propaganda, if I can use the term. So they used
Yes.
all these techniques to make sure that the world became aware of the atrocities that were committed by the West Pakistanis against the Bengalis in East
Yes.
Pakistan. And
Yes.
because the hope was that even though the governments don't sort of support India, at least the international public opinion is in favor of India. So that was what India wanted, right? So these two operations were parallelly happening till August. It is only from August on when India realized that there's virtually no other option, and the problem is escalated to such a level that we need to create at least some zone within East Pakistan which we can declare as independent Bangladesh, or and have a government in exile and so on. It is only then that the Indian Army also gets into the picture and so on, and RNAW becomes this nodal agency to manage the entire operations. Right. So
Yes.
that is how complex and convoluted the decision to conduct a covert action happens. So yes, India has always wanted to have influence in its neighborhood, protect governments which are in its favor, or make regime changes when it is found that the governments have not been in favor. But it is not something, it is not done through a sense of hooliganism or something that we are strong and we pump in weapons and things just change. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we failed in Sri Lanka, right? Because there was no clarity
Yes.
like the way we saw in East Pakistan. In East Pakistan, we had a clear strategy. We said that this is what this is how we want the operations to take shape. And at a certain point, when we found it ideal, that's when we decided to strike and say, this is now we are going to create an independent state of Bangladesh. But in Sri Lanka,
Yes.
we never wanted an independent Tamil state, right? That was never there
Right.
on our agenda. So then you had different personalities coming up at different points in time, assessments went wrong and so on, which taught us that, carrying out a court action like the kind that we pulled off in 1971 is not always possible. Different situations have come up with their own complexities and challenges, which we will have to deal with as things evolve. So that was a lesson we learned then. But overall speaking, it has been India's policy that we cannot afford to have governments in the neighborhood that are not in favor of us. Today, it has become far more
Yes.
challenging because it was far easier to keep extra regional powers like the Soviet Union or the United States out of the neighborhood. But it has become increasingly difficult to keep China out of the neighborhood. So we are
Yes.
seeing a lot more, covert activities happening in our neighborhood, but now in tough competition with the Chinese.
The next part of this episode will be continued in episode 33. So I kindly request you to click on the episode 33's link below in the description of this episode. Thank you and enjoy the conversation.